There are moments in life that come softly, not like storms, not like earthquakes, not like lightning that splits the sky open, but like the first drop of rain after a long drought. Quiet, tender, gentle. No one hears the beginning, but everyone feels its presence when it finally arrives. For Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, that moment began 19 years ago, long after the headlines went quiet, long after cameras stopped chasing shadows between them, long after audiences stopped whispering, "What if?" Yet even silence has an echo. And sometimes, the loudest stories are the ones never told. Their story in this imagined world did not bloom fast like wildfire. It was slow like sunrise, soft like snowfall, strong like mountains. Not love that demanded attention, but love that waited. Love that survived in the quiet spaces between two souls who had lived enough, lost enough, seen enough to understand that connection is not measured in loud confessions. But in the gentle way, two people return to each other again and again without needing to speak. Scene 1, the reunion that no one expected. It was a late autumn evening in Los Angeles, the kind where sunlight melts into gold across the pavement, and the wind carries the scent of leaves that have lived a full season. Keanu stepped out of the black car slowly, adjusting the collar of his charcoal suit. His hair, longer now, framed a face softened by years of contemplation. His steps were calm, unhurried, as if he carried time instead of chasing it. The charity event was already glowing with lights, laughter pressing against the walls like glittering waves. But Keanu didn't notice the cameras or the red carpet or the voices calling his name. He only noticed the quiet in his own chest and the absence he had carried for years without admitting it to himself. Inside, Sandra Bullock stood near a grand piano, her hand resting lightly on the polished wood. She wore a simple ivory gown, elegant, graceful, shining without effort. Her eyes, still holding that familiar spark of mischief and warmth, scanned the room with no expectation. She was here to speak about kindness, about rebuilding broken lives, about hope, themes she believed in deeply. But her heart shifted when she turned and saw him. Keanu, a name that wasn't just a name, but a memory, a history, a small universe of shared jokes, unfinished sentences, and moments of almost. Their eyes met across the hall like two stars recognizing each other across the dark. And just like that, silence spoke louder than applause. No script. No interview. No cameras needed. They simply walked toward one another. Slowly, deliberately, as if years were folding into a single breath. The conversation that should have happened years ago. "Hi," Sandra whispered first, voice fragile, as though one wrong word might break time itself. Keanu smiled, soft, sincere, eyes glimmering with a warmth he didn't try to hide. "Hi," he echoed, "been a while." "Too long." There was no bitterness in her tone, only truth. A truth they both felt but never confronted. They stood close but careful, like two people approaching a wound with steady hands. "How have you been?" Keanu asked. Simple words, but his voice carried something deeper, concern, curiosity, something unspoken. Sandra exhaled, as if releasing years of unasked questions. "Living, learning, healing," she paused. "You?" Keanu looked down briefly, then back up, his eyes shining with the quiet strength of someone who had known pain, loss, and still chosen gentleness. Surviving, growing, trying to do right by life. The air between them softened, warmed, like a window opening in spring. There were 100 things they could have said, apologies, confessions, regrets, but neither rushed. They had waited years to speak. They could wait minutes more. Chapter 2, What the Public Never Saw. They slipped away from the crowd, choosing a balcony with soft lanterns glowing overhead. The night wrapped them gently, and the city shimmered beneath like a sea of possibilities. Keanu leaned on the railing, quiet, reflective, the way he always was when the world fell still. Sandra stood beside him, not touching, but close enough that their shoulders felt the pull of gravity, of memory, of something deeper. "You ever think," Sandra began slowly, eyes tracing the skyline, "that timing isn't just bad luck, but a lesson?" Keanu smiled, the kind of smile that hides truth but doesn't deny it. "I think timing is life's way of saying, not yet." She turned to him, studying him not as an actor, not as a colleague, not as a friend from the past, but as a man who had carried strength, pain, resilience, kindness all in silence. "And what if," she continued carefully, "life finally says now?" Keanu inhaled deep, steady, brave. Then I hope I'm ready for it. Sandra's voice softened like candlelight. Maybe, she whispered, we both are. The words trembled, not with doubt but possibility. For the first time in years, they weren't avoiding the truth. They were inching toward it. Flashback, the almost love they never spoke about. During filming years ago, fictionally in this story, everyone noticed how well they moved around each other, light-hearted jokes, quiet glances, laughter that came too easily and lasted too long. They shared coffee between takes, rehearsed lines under dim hallway lights, and stole moments that felt like the beginning of something tender. But life was not aligned back then. Different commitments, different fears, the weight of work, the unpredictability of fame, timing was a puzzle they never solved. They could have been something, but they were not yet. Life kept them walking different paths, but never so far that they couldn't still see each other across the distance. Maybe true connection doesn't disappear. Maybe it waits, quietly, patiently, until both hearts are finally unafraid. Present, the night that changed everything. Back on the balcony, Keanu finally spoke the sentence that had lived inside him for years like an unopened letter. Sandra, I've missed you. The honesty of it broke her breath. Not a confession of love, but the kind of truth deeper than romance. A truth of presence, of soul, of recognition. Her voice trembled back. I missed you too, more than I ever said. Silence followed, not empty, not awkward, but full, like rain clouds heavy with unshed feeling. Then Keanu took a step closer, slowly, carefully, giving her every chance to step back. She didn't. Their hands brushed lightly. Electric but tender. A touch years overdue. Sandra whispered, "Why did we wait so long?" Keanu's reply was soft as dusk. Maybe we needed to grow into the people capable of this conversation. Her eyes warmed. Maybe we needed pain to understand love. Maybe, he agreed. And the space between maybe and certainty thinned into something undeniable. The unspoken confession. They stood inches apart, two souls who had loved without words, waited without promises, hoped without guarantees. The breeze carried their unspoken years between them, gentle and forgiving. Sandra looked at him, really looked. At the man, not the star, not the legend, but the human being with stories behind his eyes. You make the world softer, she said, voice clear, certain. Keanu blinked, stunned by the simplicity of the truth he'd never expected to hear. And you, he answered, make it warmer. Her breath hitched. His heart steadied. And though neither said I love you, something deeper was spoken. Not with words, but with presence. Not with confession, but with connection. Not loud, but truthful. The night settled around them like a gentle curtain, the world inside the charity venue fading until it felt like the balcony existed outside of time. The city hummed below, cars passing like distant dreams, skyscraper windows flickering like scattered memories, but nothing was louder than the silence between Keanu and Sandra. Not an empty silence, but the kind that carries heartbeat against heartbeat, soul recognizing soul, breath finding breath. Sandra leaned slightly closer, her voice soft but unwavering as she finally asked a question she had rehearsed in her mind for years, but never dared to speak aloud. Do you ever wonder what we would have become if we hadn't walked away? Keanu's eyes lifted to hers, a gaze that carried tenderness, regret, hope, and something deeper beneath the surface like a river shimmering beneath ice. He inhaled slowly, as if gathering years of unsaid words. I think about it more often than I should, he confessed, voice low and steady. Not with pain, just with curiosity, like a story paused instead of ended. Sandra felt her chest tighten, not with sadness, but with the overwhelming realization that the unspoken connection she once believed was one-sided was not hers alone. I told myself that chapter closed, she whispered, fingers tracing the cold metal of the balcony railing. I convinced myself life knew better, but some people never leave you, they just wait quietly for you to return. Keanu turned fully toward her, stepping close enough that the warmth of his presence settled over her like a soft coat against the night chill. His voice was deeper, more grounded now, not a question, but a truth. We never finished what we began, we just stopped talking about it. And there it was, the acknowledgement of years lost, of roads diverged, of feelings folded into silence. Sandra's eyes shone, not with tears but with clarity as she finally allowed herself to say the words she once swallowed for the sake of timing, careers, fear, and everything life had placed between them. I cared for you, Keanu, more than I knew how to explain, more than I believed I had the right to feel. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. It was courage disguised as vulnerability. Keanu's reply came like sunlight breaking through clouds. And I cared for you too, but back then I didn't understand what love required. I thought loving someone meant staying silent until the world made it safe to speak. He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle around them like falling snow. But love isn't supposed to wait for permission. It grows even in silence. The balcony lights flickered gently, casting golden hues over their faces, memories dancing between shadows and warmth. Sandra exhaled deeply, as if releasing years of suppressed longing. I guess we both waited for the other to say something first, she murmured, almost laughing at the irony of two strong, fearless people who had conquered worlds yet hesitated with each other. Keanu nodded, understanding more deeply than she realized. We were protecting something we didn't want to break, he said softly. Sometimes love hides because it's too precious to risk. Sandra looked out at the city again, but her heart was fully present here with him. Maybe we're not too late, she said quietly, hoping, wondering, afraid, brave all at once. Keanu followed her gaze, eyes reflecting both possibility and caution. Maybe, he answered, voice steady like a promise. Or maybe life just gave us a second beginning. They didn't rush into romance, didn't leap into confessions or declarations. They simply returned, slowly, carefully, like rivers finding their original course. They went back inside together, but something fundamental had shifted. Heads turned as they walked side by side, not touching, yet connected by a magnetic pull visible even to strangers. People whispered, curious, but Keanu and Sandra moved as though they were the only two souls in existence. Inside the hall, speeches about charity and hope echoed through the room. Sandra stepped toward the stage, her name called gently by the host. She glanced back at Keanu, a small, silent request. Without a word, he nodded reassurance in a single look. She walked forward with grace, but her voice that night carried something new, a softness edged with strength, like a heart that had rediscovered its missing rhythm. Sandra spoke about kindness, about healing, about life's unpredictable generosity. But woven between her words was something invisible, something only one person in the audience could decode. She talked about the people who come into our lives like a lesson and remain like a blessing. She talked about silent bonds, about unspoken understanding, about two souls who keep finding their way back. And Keanu listened, not as the world saw him, but as a man recognizing himself in every metaphor she shared. The room watched Sandra Bullock, but Keanu Reeves heard Sandra, the woman, the heart, the truth beneath the speech. When she stepped down, Keanu was there waiting, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her. She smiled softly, and he returned it with an expression that said everything neither had said aloud. They sat together at a round table draped in white linen, candlelight flickering like tiny beating hearts between them. Their conversation deepened, not surface level, but soul level. They talked not about movies or fame or the noise of the world, but about childhood memories, fears they once hid, wounds still tender, dreams they hadn't spoken aloud in years. Sandra talked about her doubts, how she often questioned whether love was meant for people who had seen loss. Keanu listened with sincerity only a man familiar with grief could hold. Love doesn't avoid the broken, he said gently. It chooses them because broken hearts know how to hold carefully. Sandra's eyes glistened, not from pain but from recognition, the kind that happens when someone finally speaks the language your soul has been thinking in for years. She reached across the table, fingers brushing his lightly, hesitant at first, then steady. Keanu turned his hand, palm open, welcoming hers with warmth that flowed through her veins like returning sunlight after an endless winter. Nothing dramatic happened, no kiss, no fireworks, just two hands finding each other like puzzle pieces that never belonged anywhere else. To outsiders, it might have looked simple. To them, it was a confession without words. Later in the evening, when the event began to end and guests drifted out in slow waves, neither of them moved toward the exit. They stayed long after applause faded, sharing stories only two people with shared history and unspoken affection could understand. Keanu spoke about loneliness, about nights spent wondering if connection meant risking hurt again. Sandra responded with her own truths, how love both frightened and fascinated her, how she had learned strength through survival but never forgotten softness. By the time they finally left the venue, the night had deepened into quiet tranquility. Outside, streetlights cast warm halos onto the pavement. Keanu walked Sandra to her car, but neither reached for door handles. They stood instead beneath the soft hum of the street lamp, shadows mingling like threads that had waited too long to weave. Sandra lifted her eyes to his, tired yet bright, uncertain yet hopeful. "Tell me something real," she whispered, "something you never said before." Keanu stepped closer slowly, giving her space to retreat if she wished. But she didn't move. His voice was low, intimate, trembling only with truth. "You were the one connection I never let myself forget." Sandra's breath caught not because she didn't expect it, but because she did, and hearing it felt like exhaling after years underwater. She touched his chest lightly, fingers resting over his heart. "And you," she answered, voice warm and unguarded, "were the quiet in my loud world." His pulse beneath her hand was steady, present, alive. Keanu leaned his forehead against hers, no kiss, just closeness. Real, gentle, grounding. The kind of moment where two souls confess not through words but through presence. He closed his eyes and breathed her in, feeling years fold into the space between heartbeats. Sandra closed hers too, the world fading until there was nothing but warmth, memory, possibility. They didn't force the moment into a declaration. They didn't label what was happening. They simply stayed, forehead to forehead, breath mingling, hearts speaking the language only connection understands. And in that silent exchange, part two of their story wrote itself not with ink but with feeling. This was not the night they fell in love. This was the night they admitted they always were. The following weeks unfolded like chapters no one planned, yet both felt destined to live. After their reunion that night, Sandra and Keanu didn't rush into declarations or grand gestures. Instead, they took slow steps, the kind that build foundation rather than spark. They exchanged messages that were simple but warm, thoughtful but unforced. Sometimes it was just a photo of a sunrise one of them saw during an early morning walk, or a line from a book that made them laugh, or a memory of a moment from years ago when a joke between them made an entire set burst into laughter. Their conversations were gentle, patient, rooted in presence rather than expectation. Two souls reacquainting themselves with a rhythm they once shared, but never fully explored. Months passed, and with each passing day, something unspoken continued to grow, not loud like addiction, but steady like devotion. Sandra found herself smiling at her phone in the middle of busy mornings, rereading messages not because they were romantic, but because they made her feel understood. Keanu, on the other hand, felt a kind of peace through their connection, not excitement that fades like fire, but calm like ocean tides. It amazed him how she could brighten his day simply by existing in it. People noticed, not the public, not tabloids, but friends, colleagues, the quiet circle of confidants who had known both of them long enough to feel the shift. Sandra seemed lighter, more open in interviews, her laughter unguarded. Keanu appeared softer, more centered, as if he had found a missing balance. Neither confirmed anything, there was nothing to label yet, only something to nurture. Love was slowly forming, not out of sudden passion, but out of recognition. One evening, Sandra invited Keanu to her home, a private dinner, no cameras, no atmosphere of spotlight, just two people in a space that felt safe. Her home was warm, filled with soft lighting, earth tones, a piano resting against the wall like a quiet companion. Keanu arrived with flowers, not roses or grand bouquets, but white lilies, delicate and graceful. Sandra paused when she saw them, touched by the intentionality. "You remembered," she whispered gently. "You once said they remind you of resilience," he replied. "And you've always been the most resilient person I've known." Dinner was quiet but filled with conversation, not the kind that fills silence, but the kind that deepens connection. They spoke of aging, of loss, of how fame teaches you to smile even when your heart is heavy. Sandra confessed that sometimes the world expected her to be strong when she wanted to be held. Keanu admitted that he had spent years building walls because he didn't want the world to see him break. And together, in the dim light of her dining room, they began dismantling those walls piece by piece, word by word, moment by moment. After dinner, Sandra played the piano softly, fingers gliding across keys with a familiarity only memory carries. Keanu listened, eyes closed, breathing in the sound like oxygen. She wasn't performing, she was sharing, and when she finished, the silence afterward felt like more music. Keanu moved closer, sitting beside her without touching, just close enough to feel her warmth. "You play like someone who has lived," he said quietly. Sandra looked at him, eyes soft. "And you listen like someone who understands." It was then in that stillness that something inside both of them shifted, subtle but undeniable. Sandra's hand drifted toward his, and Keanu turned his palm upward, their fingers interlacing naturally as though their hands had always known this shape. Neither spoke. Words would have broken the moment instead of completing it. For a few minutes they simply sat there, breathing the same air, existing in the same heartbeat, silently acknowledging that whatever this was, it was growing. But growth does not come without friction. As their bond deepened, Keanu found himself terrified of it, not because he didn't want it, but because he wanted it too deeply. Love, to him, was fragile. He had lost before. He had learned that the more precious something is, the more heartbreaking it becomes to imagine losing. So when he felt himself falling deeper, he did what human hearts sometimes do, he pulled back. Not abruptly, not coldly, just slightly, enough for Sandra to feel it. Messages that once came nightly now came every few days. Calls shortened, plans postponed. He still cared, but fear wrapped itself around his ribs like invisible vines. He was trying to protect something, yet unintentionally hurting it. Sandra noticed, not with anger, but with ache. She had lost before too, she had cared too much once and been left carrying silence like a scar. But this time she didn't run. She didn't accuse or demand explanation. Instead, she reached out one evening and asked gently, "Are you afraid of where this could lead?" Keanu froze when he read the message. Because yes, he was afraid. Afraid of hope, afraid of possibility, afraid of the future that looked beautiful but uncertain. And so instead of deflecting, instead of hiding behind humor or vagueness, he replied honestly, "I don't want to lose you, and the closer we get, the more real that fear becomes." Sandra read it 3 times before she exhaled. Not disappointment, understanding, because she felt it too. She typed slowly, thoughtfully, each word chosen not to push him but to meet him where he stood. "We can move slowly. We don't need definitions, just presence, one step at a time." Keanu stared at her reply for a long while, heart softened by the grace she offered. She wasn't asking for promises. She wasn't asking for labels. She was simply asking him to stay. And that was something he could do. The next day he showed up at her door unannounced, nervous but determined. Sandra opened the door in casual clothes, hair tied loosely, no makeup, pure simplicity. And Keanu, seeing her without the world's decoration, felt something inside him fall even deeper. He didn't bring flowers, didn't bring gifts. He just brought himself open, present, unguarded. "I don't want distance," he said, voice quiet but unwavering. "I just want to learn how to walk this path with you without running from it." Sandra stepped aside, allowing him in, no questions asked. She simply touched his cheek gently and whispered, "Then we walk slowly but together." It was not a contract or confession of love, but a commitment to try, and sometimes trying is more romantic than any declaration. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. They spent more time together, hiking early mornings through whispering trails, cooking meals that ended in playful arguments about too much salt or too little pepper. Watching old films on her couch while sharing a blanket neither acknowledged was symbolic of how naturally they gravitated toward closeness. Slowly, patience became the soil, tenderness the water, honesty the sunlight. Their bond rooted itself deeper with every shared moment. One night, while walking along a quiet beach under a sky full of stars, Sandra finally asked the question that had lived beneath everything they were building. "When you see the future, do you see me in it?" She said it with no demand, no pressure, just truth. Keanu stopped walking. The waves whispered against the shore, moonlight washed over them like quiet blessing, and the air held its breath waiting for his answer. He looked into her eyes and spoke the words without trembling. "Yes, I just don't know how to say it without breaking." Sandra understood. He wasn't afraid of loving, he was afraid of losing. So she took his face gently in her hands, as if holding a story too precious to drop, and whispered, "Then don't say it, live it." Keanu closed his eyes, the ocean behind them roaring like approval, and for the first time he leaned in slowly, not to kiss, but to rest his forehead against hers the way they once did. The same position, the same closeness. But now something had changed. It was not nostalgia, it was beginning. It was not memory, it was promise. Love had not been spoken, yet it had never been clearer. Love, even in its gentlest form, is never without friction. It asks for patience, demands vulnerability, and invites truth with the same tenderness it offers comfort. As Sandra and Keanu stepped into a new rhythm of togetherness, they discovered that closeness is not measured by time spent, but by fear faced, wounds exposed, and the courage to stay when running feels easier. For months, their connection grew strength like oak. They shared dinners, conversations, quiet mornings with coffee on the back porch. They took long drives where music filled the spaces words didn't need to. Sometimes they laughed like children, other times they talked like souls who had lived many lives. Yet beneath all the warmth lived something more complex, two hearts learning how to trust again after years of guarding themselves. And then life tested them, not with betrayal or conflict, but something subtler, more human, more inevitable: insecurity. It began one evening when Sandra prepared a small gathering at her home, close friends, nothing extravagant. Keanu arrived late, not intentionally, but a delay that could not be avoided. When he walked in, the room brightened, but Sandra noticed something: how people gravitated toward him, how admiration filled the space like perfume. Compliments rushed his way, praises layered with affection. None of it was romantic, but her heart tightened anyway, not out of jealousy, but out of fear. Fear of losing something she hadn't fully accepted she wanted. Fear that the world loved him too, and she might not be the one he chose in the end. Keanu, perceptive as always, noticed her quietness later that night. After guests left, he sat beside her on the sofa, legs angled toward her, presence open and patient. "You went silent," he said softly. His voice wasn't accusatory, it was curious, caring. Sandra hesitated, not wanting to sound fragile, but honesty had built their foundation so far, and she refused to hide now. "I'm still learning how to believe I'm enough," she answered, voice thick with vulnerability she rarely shared aloud. The confession hung in the room like a raw truth, delicate, exposed, real. Keanu's gaze softened instantly, and he reached for her hand, holding it with reverence. "You've always been enough. It was me who doubted myself," he replied. His thumb traced gentle lines across her knuckles, slow, steady, grounding. "The world sees me, but they don't know me. You do, you know the parts I don't put on screen." Sandra's eyes shimmered. "And you know mine," she whispered. "The tired parts, the quiet fears, the dreams I don't say because I'm afraid they'll slip away." He squeezed her hand, firm, reassuring. "You don't slip away, you stand." And that truth sat between them like a steady flame. But insecurity, once awakened, does not vanish overnight. It returns in waves, testing, asking, sometimes shaking the heart before allowing it to grow. Days later, Keanu faced a moment of doubt himself. A script offer arrived, a major role, demanding months on location, oceans away from the world they were building quietly. He stared at the contract for hours before mentioning it to her, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he feared the change it would bring. Distance had pulled them apart once. What if it happened again? When he finally told Sandra, she listened, not with panic, but with calm, though a tremor lived beneath her words. "You deserve this opportunity," she said, meaning it. "You've worked for it. You don't have to stay because of us." Keanu studied her face carefully, searching for fear, hesitation, regret, and he found all three flickering beneath her strength. "I don't want to lose what we're building," he admitted, voice low, steady, afraid. Sandra leaned closer, resting a hand over his heart, feeling it beat, alive, afraid here. "Love doesn't stop because of distance," she whispered. "It stops when people stop reaching." Keanu closed his eyes, breathing in her words like oxygen. She wasn't holding him back, she was letting him fly, hoping he'd return. But hope is still fragile, like glass warmed by sunlight. In the weeks before his departure, they spent time wrapped in simplicity: grocery shopping, late-night tea on the balcony, movie marathons where neither watched the screen, too busy memorizing each other instead. There were moments Sandra would turn and find him observing her, silent, thoughtful, as if carving her into memory. Keanu, too, would catch her watching him cook, her eyes full of something deeper than affection. Something like acceptance, like fear, like love unspoken, because love not yet defined feels safer when held between breaths. The night before he left, they met on the same beach where Sandra once asked if she lived in his future. The ocean roared beneath a sky heavy with moonlight, silver waves reflecting the uncertainty in their chests. They walked barefoot through cool sand, shoulders brushing, hands occasionally grazing as though deciding whether to hold or release. Sandra stopped first, turning to him with eyes that glimmered like sea-wet stars. "I'm not asking you to stay," she said, steady despite the fragile thrum in her pulse. "I'm asking you not to disappear." Keanu stepped closer until the wind carried her breath into his own. His voice was almost a whisper, but strong with honesty. "I don't want distance to become silence," he murmured. "I don't want absence to become ending." Sandra exhaled shakily, not from fear, but from years of longing finally named. "Then promise me something real," she said. "Not forever, just presence." Keanu lifted her hand, bringing it slowly to his chest, anchoring it there like a vow made without ceremony. "I promise I will come back," he said. No dramatic declarations, no cinematic final kiss, just a promise, raw, human, true. The next morning he left plane taking him across continents, the seat beside him empty but not hollow. Sandra stood by the window long after he was gone, watching the sky swallow the jet trail, feeling her heartbeat whisper a plea she never voiced aloud. "Return to me." And though distance stretched between them, something invisible stretched too, unbroken, unfrayed, unseen by the world, but felt like pulse beneath skin. At first, communication came like river flow, texts every morning, voice notes before sleep, photos of sunsets from two different horizons. They laughed through screens, shared exhaustion through midnight calls, held connection through digital threads that felt strangely physical. But time zones, schedules, pressure, they are clever thieves. Days began sliding between messages. Hours stretched. Replies delayed. Not because love faded, but because life is loud. Sandra felt absence like a quiet ache. Keanu felt longing like a heartbeat he couldn't slow. One night after 14 hours on set, he stared at his phone with her unread message glowing against the dark, and exhaustion pulled him into sleep before he replied. Sandra waited, then slept with her phone against her pillow, not angry, just wishing time could bend toward them. Weeks passed, they did not fall apart, they stretched thin. Then came the moment everything shifted. Sandra boarded a plane without telling him. Not to test him, not to surprise romantically, but because she needed truth. She needed to see if closeness survived distance, if presence survived silence, if two hearts could still find each other across oceans. Hours later, she stood at his filming location, a soft breeze carrying the scent of rain and sand. Keanu walked out of the studio, tired but glowing with purpose, unaware she was there. When he saw her, time didn't pause. It exhaled. His bag slipped from his hand. He crossed the distance in seconds, but hugged her like he'd been walking toward her for years. No words needed. His eyes said, "You're here," hers said, "I came back." And in that embrace, every doubt fell away like ash in wind. Distance had not broken them. It had proved them. Keanu held her face gently, forehead resting on hers, the gesture that became their unspoken language. Sandra's voice trembled against his breath. "I was afraid we'd lose ourselves." Keanu replied with a truth steady as heartbeat. "We didn't lose anything, we found how much it mattered." The ocean roared in the distance. The horizon opened. Their story deepened. Not because they finally said, "I love you," but because they lived like they did. The days Sandra spent with Keanu during filming unfolded like pages still warm from creation, each one soaked in the weight of presence and the softness of rediscovery. She stayed in that city longer than she originally planned, not because the place was extraordinary, but because the man she found there was. They fell into a rhythm shaped by ordinary moments, the kind of moments that make extraordinary love. Breakfast in muted morning light, script pages scattered over coffee cups, quiet walks near the shore where the sky melted into the ocean without edges. Sandra watched Keanu move with calm intensity on set, admired the way he disappeared into characters yet remained entirely himself in silent corners. He watched Sandra sit quietly during breaks, eyes filled with curiosity, reflection, something tender and unnamed, a woman at peace and in battle at the same time. They existed not as stars, not as headlines, but as two human beings who had learned too much, lost too much, survived too much to take a heart lightly. One evening after a long shooting day, they drove away from the lights and noise until the road narrowed into quiet countryside. The air smelled of earth warmed by fading sun. Cicadas hummed like distant memories. They parked near an open field where wild grass swayed like ocean waves. There was no music, no agenda, only night sky and unspoken truth. Keanu sat on the hood of the car, Sandra beside him, shoulders touching gently, breath rising into cool twilight. For a long time, neither spoke. Silence had become their language, not avoidance but comfort. The kind of silence that invites hearts to speak without words. Sandra tilted her head back, watching stars appear slowly as though night itself was painting them. "Do you think," she asked softly, "that some people meet too early, lose each other, grow separately, and then return exactly when their hearts are finally mature enough to hold what they couldn't before?" She spoke it not as theory, but as confession disguised as question. Keanu turned to her, his profile carved by moonlight, expression thoughtful and sincere. "I think timing isn't wrong or right," he answered. "It's simply preparation. We were meant to meet then so we could remember now." His voice was low, steady like a truth he had sat with for years. Sandra's chest tightened, her pulse a quiet drum beneath her skin. I spent so long convincing myself feelings fade with time, she admitted, eyes still on the sky. But they don't fade. They transform, grow roots, deepen. They become something you don't lose, just something you don't speak. Keanu leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes distant as if searching memory. I carried you, he said after a long pause. Not like weight, like presence. Sandra looked at him, stunned by the simple gravity of his words. He continued, voice trembling with vulnerability he rarely allowed the world to see. On long nights in strange cities, when life felt heavy, you were a quiet thought that steadied me. I used to wonder what it would feel like to see you again. I never expected it to feel like coming home. Sandra felt emotion rise in her throat, not tears of pain, but tears of recognition, of finally hearing what her heart had whispered alone for years. She moved closer until her knee touched his. You were a place I didn't know I was still living in, she replied. I tried to move forward, tried to silence the part of me that wondered what we could have been if we weren't so afraid. Keanu met her gaze then, fully, deeply, without flinching. And in that look was every year they survived separately, every almost that never became, every second their hearts waited. The air thickened with meaning, with possibility, with the kind of truth too heavy for casual sentences. Keanu took a slow breath, as if steadying himself before walking through a door that once scared him. I need to say something, he began, voice low but unwavering. Sandra's heart hammered. She did not move, did not breathe too deeply, afraid the moment might fracture. Keanu's eyes glimmered under starlight, and when he spoke again, his words fell like soft thunder, gentle but earth-shifting. I love you. Not dramatic, not rushed, not embellished, just real. Sandra froze, not from shock, but from the overwhelming relief of hearing aloud what her soul already knew. Her breath trembled, chest tightening as emotion flooded through her like tides returning to shore. She had imagined those words before, but never like this, never with such calm truth beneath them. Her voice came slowly, like petals unfurling after years of drought. I love you too, she whispered. I think I always did, even when I didn't know how to hold it safely. They didn't fall into each other. They didn't kiss immediately. They sat with those words, letting them breathe, letting them settle into the sacred space between them. That silence became more intimate than 1,000 embraces, two people finally speaking a truth their hearts carried in quiet devotion for years. Sandra reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his tightly. Keanu turned his palm to secure hers, grounding them both. The world around them blurred, sound faded, night deepened. Nothing existed but the pulse they shared between joined hands. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time surrendered. Eventually, Sandra leaned her head onto his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the rhythm of his breathing, the quiet hum of love unmasked. Keanu rested his cheek against her hair, eyes closing with peace he had not felt in decades. They didn't need grand gestures, fireworks, declarations screamed at the sky. They had something greater, steady love born from years of patience, silence, distance, return. When she finally lifted her head, their faces inches apart, breath mingling softly, Keanu brushed a strand of hair from her face with reverence. Not as a man claiming affection, but as a soul recognizing his other. Sandra placed her palm against his jaw, warm and sure, eyes searching his like someone finally seeing the truth she once feared was only her imagination. We took years to say what our hearts knew, she whispered, voice breaking with beauty instead of pain. Keanu brought his forehead to hers, their signature touch. And finally, after decades of unspoken almosts, they kissed. It was not desperate, not rushed. It was slow, deep, patient, like two lives stitching back together with tenderness instead of urgency. The kiss tasted of relief, of forgiveness, of time reclaimed. It was the kind of kiss that doesn't spark love, it confirms it. When they finally pulled away, breath warm, eyes shining, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Everything had been said by hearts long before words ever arrived. From that night forward, love was no longer unspoken. Love does not bloom in grand gestures alone. Sometimes it grows in the small, quiet decisions, choosing to stay when distance could separate, choosing to speak when silence feels safer, choosing to hold another heart even when the world is loud enough to drown whispers. After their confession beneath the quiet sky, Sandra and Keanu stepped into a new chapter not defined by dramatic promises or perfect certainty, but by presence. They returned from that field not as two people hoping for connection, but as two souls finally willing to carry it with both hands. Weeks passed and filming continued, but something subtle shifted in every moment they shared. Morning coffee tasted softer. Hand-holding during late walks became instinct rather than decision. Arguments still happened, not explosive ones, but real ones. Two grown hearts learning how to merge after years of independence will always crash occasionally, but every conflict ended not with doors closing, but with deeper understanding. Love, they learned, isn't the absence of fear. It is choosing to rise with it instead of hiding beneath it. Sandra extended her stay in the filming city until Keanu's project wrapped, not out of dependency but out of choice. She built her own routine there, writing, volunteering quietly at a small community center, finding joy in anonymity that fame rarely allowed her. Keanu visited her between shoots, sometimes tired, sometimes silent, yet always present. Sandra never demanded more of him than what he honestly had to give, and in return, Keanu never withheld honesty. They communicated openly, even when truths were uncomfortable. They learned to ask rather than assume, to listen rather than defend. It was imperfect, human, real love, the kind people spend lifetimes searching for without recognizing when it stands patiently at the door. When filming finally ended, they returned to Los Angeles together, not publicly announced, not photographed by flashing cameras, but privately, quietly, two people walking through airport terminals side by side, luggage rolling in rhythm like heartbeat to heartbeat. On the plane ride home, Sandra fell asleep against Keanu's shoulder, and he watched her with an expression that could only belong to someone who had found peace after years of searching. He brushed a soft kiss against the top of her head, not to wake her, but to honor the gift of her presence. That gesture meant more than any dramatic declaration ever could. Back home, challenges arrived, not because love was weak, but because life is real. Schedules clashed, responsibilities demanded time apart, interviews pulled them into different worlds. There were days when Sandra woke in a quiet house and missed his voice, days when Keanu sat in dressing rooms wishing she could see the world through his tired eyes. But instead of letting distance carve silence, they built bridges, late-night calls, shared reading lists, handwritten notes slipped into bags before flights, voice messages that sounded like warm arms wrapped around exhaustion. They did not try to merge into one life forcibly. They learned to intertwine gently. Sandra continued her philanthropic work with renewed passion, often inviting Keanu to join, not as a star, but as a human wanting to help. Keanu continued filming, his craft now layered with the softness of a heart unburdened. Together, they attended small gatherings, charity events, quiet dinners with trusted friends, never for attention, always for connection. And slowly, without headlines, without public spectacle, people around them began to feel what neither of them had to announce. They were chosen by each other. One evening months later, they visited a lakeside cabin away from the noise of the world. The air smelled of pine and water. The night sky reflected perfectly across still surface like a second world. They cooked together, badly at first, laughing when vegetables burned and spices tasted louder than expected. They danced barefoot in the kitchen to no music, Sandra's laughter echoing like wind bells, Keanu's eyes soft with devotion. After dinner, they sat on the cabin's small wooden dock, feet dangling over water, moon shimmering across waves like threads of silver stitching their silhouettes together. Sandra leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "I once feared time would break us." Keanu turned slightly, brushing his lips across her forehead. "Time didn't break us," he murmured. "It prepared us." She smiled at that, not because it was poetic, but because it was true. Everything they had lost, everything they had carried, every year they spent apart had shaped them into people finally capable of loving gently, deeply, without fear swallowing connection. There under that sky, Keanu reached into his pocket, not with nervousness, but with certainty. He pulled out a small wooden box, not fancy, not elegant, but carved by hand, his hand, sanded smooth, imperfect, real. Sandra looked down at it, breath slowing like the world was waiting too. Keanu opened it slowly, revealing not a ring of diamonds, but something more meaningful. A simple silver band engraved on the inside with words small but infinite. It was always you. He didn't ask for marriage. He didn't ask for forever. He offered presence. A commitment not defined by titles but by truth. "I don't want to hold you with promises," he said, voice low and steady. "I want to hold you with choice every day, even when love is quiet, even when life is loud." Sandra's heart broke open with warmth that felt like sunlight and ocean tide and safety all at once. She took the ring gently, not like possession, but like remembrance. "I choose you too," she whispered. "Not because it's easy, but because it's real." She slid the band onto her finger, and Keanu kissed her hands tenderly, slowly, reverently. They stayed on that dock long after the moon crossed the sky, leaning into each other, sharing warmth, dreaming of tomorrows without needing to script them. And somewhere in the quiet movement of night, love settled into permanence, not loud, not demanding, simply here, like breath, like tide, like home. Time passed, but love did not fade. They didn't rush into marriage or public announcements. They lived instead building mornings, building quilts of shared memories stitched with laughter, challenges, forgiveness. They traveled quietly, loved quietly, grew loudly. Sandra found peace in partnership rather than perfection. Keanu found joy in vulnerability instead of solitude. And together they became something rare, not a love story of dramatic beginnings, but a love story of survival, patience, return. People often say true love is fireworks. But sometimes true love is sunrise, slow, inevitable, gentle, unstoppable.